Hi, thanks for coming. Listen to my brief talk here. I put this together because you're interested in coins, I'm interested in coins, but there's always an interest beyond what's on the face of coins. So I put together a little presentation. I thought that we would be amusing to people regarding some very interesting coins and tokens from 1453 to 1875. And so we'll go through a few of those here. And that's why this is called NUMISTRIVIA. The first coin that has a backstory or trivia information is a Constantine the 11th 1/8 stavrata. This was minted in 1453 during the siege of Constantinople. Constantine the 11th was the last emperor of Constantinople, and this coin is a rather interesting coin. It was one of 50 that was discovered in a hoard in the late 1980s, and it's all the pieces as you're going to see in this presentation are from my personal collection. And this is the stavrata. Now, that's the coin. The interesting thing about this coin is during the siege of Constantinople, Constantine had very little money. The city of Constantinople was essentially the Byzantine Empire. Everything around it had been taken. And the empire was essentially bankrupt. So there was very little money, not only to pay the troops to defend the city, but to do anything else. And a Hungarian gun maker named Orban presented to Constantine the opportunity perhaps to beat his adversary, Mehmed II, who over many hundreds of years of conflict from the Ottomans and the Christian Byzantine Empire wanted to take the city. It was the jewel, the pearl of that particular era. So Mehmed came in, but before that, Orban came to Constantine the 11th, and he decided he could put together a cannon, a weapon that would do what needed to be to protect the city of Constantinople. What you see here is a picture of the siege. Of course, it's an artist's rendition. Nobody was there to take a photo or to paint it, but the overtaking, and it was a miserable overtaking. Understand that most of the people who fought for Mehmed were slaves, and they would send those in waves across the beginnings of sieges because they would fill the trenches with dead bodies. And then the rest of the janissaries, the elite troops, could come in later. At any rate, that's pretty much the scene there. But the interesting thing is Orban's cannon. And during the summer of 1452, a year earlier, Orban set work at Edirne, and that's where Mehmed set up his troops, somewhere in Romania. This was after Constantine said, "I have no money to pay you." Now understand that in sieges at this time and even later into the 1800s, I would say definitely into the 1700s, the Hessian troops are an example of that. The people who fought were mercenaries and they had to be paid. And all the people who were fighting in these sieges had also to be paid. And since Orban couldn't get money from Constantine, he decided to go to Mehmed II and offer the same deal. I have this cannon that can destroy and make you lay siege, successful siege to the city of Constantinople. So Orban casted one of these in Romania, and what finally emerged from his foundry when the molds had been knocked off was a 27-foot long barrel. It was walled with 8 inches of solid bronze, and that absorbed the force of the blast. It had a diameter of 30 inches, enough for a man to enter on his hands and knees actually, and was designed to accommodate a stone shot weighed something over half a ton. Mind you, this is in 1453. In January 1453, Mehmed ordered a test firing. He wasn't going to put his money out for this cannon unless it worked. The test firing was outside his royal cannon. The cannon was hauled into position near the gate, fired gun outside the palace, primed it with powder, People climbed in, put the big stone shot inside into the ball, rolled it back, bam, fired it. Shot across the countryside for about a mile, buried itself 6 feet into the ground. Mehmed was satisfied and said he'll buy the gun. Now he addressed the big challenge once the gun was there, getting it from Edirne to Constantinople. Now, mind you, the siege is going on. A siege is not necessarily an attack. An attack is part of a siege. A siege is when they come, surround an area, and they make sure that they cut them off. And that is the classic siege. And in doing so, cities or towns or whatever would usually destroy anything outside the walls of the protected part so it could not be used by the opposition. This was all going on while Mehmed and Orban were trying to get together on this gun. Well, he finally did it, and while he was doing that, they were laying the siege works, and it took him 200 men, 60 oxen were detailed to take that gun 140 miles, traveled 2.5 miles a day. And in the process, engineers and workmen were clearing roads, building pontoon bridges to get this huge cannon with all these oxen and men to Constantinople. Took 6 weeks. 6 weeks to Constantinople. By the time it arrived, all the siege works were in place. Bam, that's what he did. Now, why do I tell the story of the cannon? Go back to the coin. You see that coin? Does that look a lot like Byzantine coins? It is reminiscent of Byzantine coins, but as you can tell, it's terribly crude. And the reason why it's crude is a testament to Orban. Viktor Orban is now the head of Hungary. I'm not talking about the 21st century Orban, I'm talking about the old Orban. At that particular time, the skilled craftsmen were like the soldiers. They needed to be paid. And when they weren't paid, they went to the other side. All the skilled craftsmen who were able to do things, engrave, to make things like that, were also very skilled gunsmiths. Many of them left because Constantine couldn't pay them. And so you see a coin that Constantine made during that particular period, like this, with Christ the Pancrator, and also then Constantine the 11th, very crude. They didn't have the skill to make nice coins. So, A, you had a gun that would have been the atomic equivalent of 1453, and B, you couldn't get any good coins because the skilled people weren't there to give it to you. That's the story behind Constantine's 1/8 Stavrata. Yes? The cannon, good question. And one question here is what happened to the cannon? The cannon was fired several times. Even that cannon, that size, couldn't take multiple blasts. It exploded, I think, 2 or 3 times into the siege. But one of the reasons is because Mehmed loved the city, and he had given instructions to his men not to despoil the city, not to destroy it. He wanted to keep it intact. So even when he won the siege and got in, and there's a long story about someone from the inside leaving a gate open to allow the first troops in, when they came in, they were allowed to ravage, steal, loot, whatever thing, but they couldn't destroy anything. So that cannon was set up in such a way that it would hit only the outside wall because you didn't want to destroy the city. And so the cannon did fire several times, but the cannon no longer exists. The one that you see there is like the one. Orban made numerous cannons, some of them in different sizes, and nothing measured more than 14 feet after that large cannon. Yeah. Henry VIII shilling. You see a picture of Henry VIII. He doesn't have a beard. That's because Henry VIII is not old here. Henry VIII is about 23, 24 years old. This shilling, everyone knows the rivalry between Great Britain and France. And there was no different in Henry's time. In Henry's time, he wanted to poke at the French as much as they did later on and prior to him. So what Henry did is he took a young Henry, took his army into France, and he took the city of Tournai. This shilling was struck to be used in the city of Tournai. You'll see here T-O-R, Tornicensis in Latin for Tournai. It's a rarer type of it, a scarce coin by any stretch of the imagination. But the backstory is, after the Battle of the Spurs, and this is a representation of it, okay? That's the French and the British Army fighting. After the Battle of the Spurs, he decided to go on to the city of Tournai. And Tournai, this is the tower that's there. For your information, that tower did not exist when Henry was there. That tower was built after Henry took the city. And it was built by Wolsey. This was a siege that never happened. And that's the backstory. He came with his army. The people of Tournai saw him there. And the citizens were saying, we've got to fight, we've got to fight. And the people running the city were saying, look at the people out there. We're outnumbered greatly. So we have to make a decision. Are we going to fight and die, or are we going to capitulate? So this particular siege by Henry VIII never truly occurred. They capitulated before anything happened. They came to reasonable conclusion that then the British would occupy the city of Tournai, and that's when Wolsey built that to protect himself. And it stands there today, and later on the French came to take the city back, but that's after the British, during their particular political struggles, decided it was against their best interest to waste money trying to put a burr under the saddle of the French and more or less take care of things at home. So that's Tournai. The next one, and is one of my favorite non-siege coins, is a testone of Alessandro de Medici, 1535. It's a gorgeous piece. You can see the classic design of Alessandro de Medici, curly hair and all. Cosmas and Damian, those are the patron saints of now history of Florence, and it was ruled by this gentleman on the right, and that is Alessandro de Medici, who was called Il Moro. In Italian, that means the dark one. And that's probably how the name the Moors became into the English language, because that was the Latin derivation into Italian for dark. And he was dark complected, but he was a patron of the arts. And he loved to bring in Benvenuto Cellini. And what I have there is, if you go into Piazza di Signoria, you'll see the statue of Perseus, which is magnificent, and works by Cellini in his artworks, his sculpturing. But he hired Benvenuto Cellini because he was a patron of the arts. The thing is, the backstory on this coin, very simply, and I will go back to it, is if you see the classic designs, most people do not realize that the dies on this coin were made personally by Benvenuto Cellini. And a person who owns this coin will actually own a work of art from a Renaissance master, and you won't have to spend $100 million in a Sotheby's auction to buy it. Now, it's not cheap by any stretch of the imagination, but still, well, even when I purchased my copy of this coin, it wasn't cheap. It's more expensive now, but it's a fabulous coin, and it's made by Benvenuto Cellini. There are other coins made by other Italians in northern Italy, there in Tuscany near Florence, and those were made by those workers in his salon. They have his same stylizations, but they're not Cellini's. The backstory and the trivia on this coin is it was made by Cellini, and it's absolutely a nifty coin. Next coin, Saint-Winoksbergen, or now in France it's called Bergu. 5 stivers, 1583. during the wars of the Spanish, not the Spanish succession, during the wars of the rise of the Dutch Republic, that's when the Spanish Netherlands were still there, that Philip II was sending armies up to try to impose the Spanish rule a little bit more firmly onto those people in that particular part. Now that's basically Belgium. The southern Netherlands at that time, the southern provinces are Belgium, and the rest later on developed into Netherlands. But this is a coin, SW, and that's the date, 5 stiver. The reason why I have this is Alessandro Farnese. Now there's another Alessandro Farnese who was a cardinal in the Vatican, and he did some political things over there. This was his nephew, Alessandro, who was a young guy, probably in his early 20s, took an army up the coast of Europe, in through the southern Netherlands province, and initially took many of the lower provinces of the Low Countries at that time, now the Netherlands or the Low Countries, and kept it for Spain. And he did very successfully. Doing my research and writing my book, Siege Coins of the World, 1453 to 1902, I knew that there was a siege in Saint-Winoksbergen. But when I wrote the book, I didn't know that there was a coin. And indeed, the coin doesn't exist in any of the old literature, because this is the only coin that survived the siege to now, historically. And the backstory is, and that's why I had to throw it in, it's the only known siege coin for that siege. And it's a small town, and there was a fight, and they historically had a nice fight. You have picture, that's Alessandro Farnese, who's there, the young gentleman, and this is an actual etching from a thing from Saint-Winoksbergen, which Bergu, and so I now have the only siege coin that was ever issued that we know of from that city. It's rather interesting and rather fascinating. And maybe the numismatic trivia is, who owns the only siege coin from Saint-Winoksbergen? Yeah, it's not going to win you a cup of coffee and a bet, but it's something maybe you know. That's all I could say. Next coin, Groningen siege. Why do I do this? One of my favorite sieges as well, because all the Groningen pieces that you'll see here or that you see anywhere were struck subsequent to the siege. These are medals. There's a series of medals that were done by Groningen, by artists in that. This is a common side of it, common side, obverse or reverse. That's the fortress of the city in Groningen, and then it depicts on one half of the coin, on the other one. Sometimes you'll get these two together, and sometimes you get one of those paired with either one, or there may be writing. At any rate, this is the siege, and the siege is a rather interesting siege. They were prepared for it. They knew that the army were going to come, and the Bishop of Münster, Bernard van Galen, was going to come and go for the city. So they prepared for it. And as I said earlier, when you have a siege, they prepare by clearing everything outside, and the people who used, even the homes, trees, homes, barns, whatever, those people then would come in and they would go in to the protective part of the city. In this case, you know, in Great Britain, it was called the keep. They went into the keep area where they were most protected. And so all those people came in and they prepared. They flattened everything out so that nothing was there for them. And during it, knowing that there would be fires in the city of Groningen, there were a lot of Anabaptists. Now, if you understand the history, Munster, the siege of Munster was against Anabaptists who took over the city. And then there was a siege in 1643, I believe it is. At any rate, the issue on that is the Anabaptists are, historically, by historians very much more intelligent than I, are considered a cult. And the Anabaptists are very closed. Celibacy, nothing worldly. It was like they closed themselves off from the world. And on the coins, even in Munster, the siege of Munster, there are no pictures of anything. There are only biblical inscriptions on the coins that they used during the siege to pay the troops. But that's not the siege I'm talking about. The reason why I brought up the Anabaptists is they were also pacifists. They would not fight under any circumstance. And so the head of the city of Groningen was smart, and part of his preparations he got the Anabaptists to be firemen. He put out the order that every town had to have buckets of water in front of it, so that during a siege, if a shell hit and started a fire, they would have water there to put the fire out, and the Anabaptists were in charge of putting out the fires. And he utilized everybody during that siege. Now, that's not the only backstory. We always hear complaints about college kids. Well, in this particular siege, the college kids actually got together and they fought valiantly. 300 to 325 college kids at the University of Groningen stood there, and they held off the troops of Bernard von Galen. Were helped a little bit by rains, helped a little bit, of course, by opening up some of the dikes to flood the area around, so that it made it very difficult for the soldiers to operate and do anything they can during their siege. But the kids did it. And they also commemorated a medal for the college kids, and that was it. I think you can say, in memoriam obsidionis et liberationis Groningen, and Academia to Groningen. And that was given to those kids, if you will, young men who fought and helped. And this, incidentally, the siege of Groningen and the victory, the first major victory by the Dutch over the Spanish during the Spanish-Dutch wars, is considered the birth of the Netherlands. This is really when they really said, yeah, we can beat them. It's almost like in today's world, Ukraine having saved the city of Kiev, they can say, wait a minute, we might be able to win this war. That's what happened to them, and they went on after a period of time then to win that war. Next backstory, Siege of the Bastille. This is a medal by Andrieux, 1789. It depicts the Siege of the Bastille. That's why it's called the Bastille medal. You know, Bastille was not a place that was really important for someone to take over, because there were anywhere between 10 to 12 people in the jail, and most of those people were the jailers, not the people. It was a symbol, and the symbol of when the French people got together, came together in the streets and stormed the Bastille and basically took it over easily. Now, it looks like a big battle because the history tends to aggrandize what happens. It was more important not as a battle, but seriously as having taken the symbol of the oppression of the monarch away from them. Okay, that's what that medal is. I have a couple over at my table you can see, and a set of Andrieux medals that they produced subsequently in around 1800s for distribution to show the history of that and the succession of Napoleon, who comes beyond that. But what's the background to that? You'll notice there is writing, and that writing was from a Monsieur Palois, and what he did was, and this is reputed, I don't know that I've been able to confirm it, but many historical sources say that it is. It is reputed that the lead from these medals that he gave to members of the Senate at that time were taken from the Bastille. So this particular medal that he had was struck from lead from the Bastille, which was symbolic of overthrowing the monarch, given to those patriots who were on the Senate who supported the revolution against the king. And that's an interesting backstory. You'll see a lot of these. Even later when the Concorde plane, the SST, was produced, they used that medal, that scene of the Siege of the Bastille on the one side of the medal. What you'll note here, though, is you see just not that. There's a bunch of writing on the side, inscription on the side, which sets this apart from the standard ones where you will see with just a scene of the Bastille. And of course, what also changes it is the fact that this has the inscription on the back that Monsieur Palois was preparing to give to one of the senators. Interesting card. Azores, Terceira Island, 80 Reis, 1826. This is a provisional issue. Many people do not realize that the Azores, of course, were under Portuguese rule, but at this particular time, the Azores didn't have a king, didn't have a monarch. The monarch died, and there was an issue now of who's going to succeed the monarch. And there was a 7-year-old girl Maria II, who now was supposed to take over, but she was too young and they had to set up a regency. So Maria went in exile because she had a brother who wanted the throne, but she was the one that Pedro the First said should succeed him. So there was a war, and I don't want to get into that, but the fact is, this woman, Maria, you see her there, this is in her teen years. She was probably about 14 or 15 when that thing was painted of her, and then there was the Constitution that finally came into place. She was born in Rio de Janeiro, so she was not Portuguese, but she was of Portuguese descent because Portugal got Brazil when the Pope set the line of demarcation, and on that side of the line they speak Portuguese, on the other side, the west side of the line, they speak Spanish. And if you want to see a good movie about that in terms of some of the conflict, the movie called The Mission is an absolutely exceptionally well-made movie, and it talks about struggles between some of the cultural differences between the Portuguese and the Spanish and the Aborigines at the time of the demarcation. But that's another story too. This is Maria in exile, and she became queen in 1826 to 1828, but she was not placed in succession until 1835. And in the back, you understand that the coins from the Azores, if you go into Kraus, start in 1829 with the cast piece. An 80 reis piece is cast during the emergency or siege. I would say more emergency than a siege coin, because it wasn't used to pay the troops, it was used to circulate during that time. But there was that coin. But there is also this coin. And the reason why I bring it is because it's a little known coin of Maria II while she was in exile. This coin, there are 4 known, 3 in museums, and I own the 4th one. Years ago, this thing came up for sale, and I sold my firstborn male child to get it, but I own it now. It was just at that point, just an interesting thing, and something that I think is historically significant. The 80 reis piece. Very nice, very nice. It's not in Kraus. It was one time. Years ago I sent it in. I think it was in a period of time, but since I'm not sure, there's not that much more knowledge about it. So it's not a thing that someone would say, oh, that's collectible. So that's probably a good idea. I'll have to talk to someone who knows people at Kraus about that. And this is the last thing, 1875S. See what that is, a 75S half dollar. You see on here, it says Beaver Falls Cutlery Company. Huh? Did you know that there was a cutlery company in Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania? If you don't, you do now. Some of you do, because you heard me babble about this at different local coin clubs at one time or another. Beaver Falls Cutlery Company. You see up there, you see it says Beaver Falls Cutlery Company. And that looks very similar to that. When I discovered this token at a local coin shop, I said, oh, I have to buy that. It's from local. So I'll go into the book and I'll find it, see what it's worth once I buy it. Well, I went to the book and it wasn't in the book. And I went to another book and it wasn't into the book. And then I went through other things and I could not find one. This is, to me, at this particular point, it's unique. Now, that doesn't mean that it's a merchant token. I call it a merchant token because, well, it's mine, I can do what I want, I guess. But it's essentially a coin that someone probably counterstamped. And you know on this coin, you can see it as a hole. So it was kept by somebody somewhere back in 1875. What are all these things here together? And this is the backstory in the numismatic trivia. Beaver Falls Cutlery Company looked like this. This is an old engraving of the Cutlery Company back in the 1870s. This is Old Economy, which exists now inside of Amherst. It was a group of Anabaptists, see, they come back up in history, led by Frederick Rapp, called the Harmonists. And I think you've heard of Harmony, Indiana, the Harmonists, okay. That still exists, and that's a picture of it today. And in the middle is one of the head Chinese. But why do I have him there? Okay. In 1872, there was a big strike at the Beaver Falls Cutlery Company. To understand that the harmonists were exceedingly wealthy and one of the most prominent businesses in the state of Pennsylvania. And they did so because they started back in the 1820s in their celibate mode, and people lived there. And when they lived there and worked there, they did it for nothing. They were essentially an Anabaptist cult. They closed themselves off from the world, and all they cared about were the things beyond, the metaphysical, the spiritual. So those people worked, and they amassed huge amounts of money over the years. Come the Civil War, they have a lot of money. But if you start in 1820 and you're not allowed to have marital relationships, the number of people who you have will drop unless you can recruit more people. Well, people in the mid-1800s are not much different than now, and it's hard to say, yeah, I don't think I want to have sex with my wife, I don't want to have children, and so the numbers of the harmonists began to decrease. They went from Harmony, Pennsylvania, which is north of Ambridge, to New Harmony, Indiana, where they thought they would be received because it's a very religious area, but people don't like outsiders no matter what faith you are or where you live in the world, and they were eventually kind of not pushed out, but they weren't welcomed in New Harmony, Indiana. They came back and they created Old Economy, or Economy, PA. We call it Old Economy because now I guess it's old, but back then it was just Economy. So they had set up this company. They were producing things and producing them well. But by the time the Civil War came and they needed to produce, they had less people, but they had money. So they became a holding company. So now you had this very ultra conservative religious cult with a lot of money who are now a holding company. And one of the things they owned was the Beaver Falls Cutlery Company. And when the Beaver Falls Cutlery Company went on strike, they couldn't do what they needed to do. So what did they do? They imported Chinese workers who were still left in the US, down in New Orleans, who were working on the Transcontinental Railroad. And a lot of people don't realize many of the workers in the Transcontinental Railroad, especially from the West Coast to Promontory Point, were Chinese laborers. And so they had a bunch of them. So they conscripted, if you will, say, hey, you don't have to go back to China. We've got work for you outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So they reduced their payroll from $13,000 a month to $5,000 a month by using Chinese laborers. And they did this for about, I'm trying to think, 1872 to 6 years, about 1878. I think 6 years they were there. And they lived in Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania. And they were good workers by all accounts. They came over, did their job. Unfortunately, just somewhat like the harmonists, the locals didn't like them, because they were considered scabs, first of all. They came and took the jobs away, they broke the strike. Second of all, they were different. Third of all, Beaver Falls was settled by extremely conservative Protestants of the Coventry sect. Do you remember Chariots of Fire, when Eric Liddell couldn't run the movie in 1928 Olympics? He was to run in the finals. The finals were on Sunday, but you don't do anything on the Lord's Day. And he was a very religious, devout, and good human being, but he didn't run, and that's why the other gentleman got the gold medal, and him, Abraham, got the gold medal, ran, because he was basically the second fastest guy in the world that time. He's American. So Liddell was English, and Abraham was an American. But at any rate, they were a very conservative town, and these people, and they were very, very staunch Christians, and Chinese were considered pagans because they didn't believe in Christ. They believed in whatever, quote, pagan religion that they had. They called them if you read accounts of it, and I have books and things on them from Beaver County where I used to live. They called them the heathen Chinese. These Chinese were taunted. 10 of them died, and there was a cemetery that they had put them in. And by all accounts, that cemetery was moved. Somebody, a benefactor, we still don't know who. I'm assuming it could have been, there was a lady, and I forget her name right now, that in Beaver Falls, who was a Christian missionary who embraced people as opposed to push them away and helped the Chinese when they were here. I think she got money up, and then they had enough. They exhumed the bodies and had them sent back to China to be buried where they are, okay, where their homeland was. And when I was researching the Beaver Falls Cutlery Company and this token, I went to the Beaver Falls Historical Society, and they have Beaver Falls cutlery. Don't tell my wife, I have so much Beaver Falls cutlery in the basement. I have it in a put away. Don't never tell her how many, but I have sets of this stuff, and they have sets like that, which is nicer. You see, that's a bone handle. Most of them were very common, like you see in your reenactors, the wooden handle ones. Most of them were like that to be used. There are silver ones, and I have one that is a set for kids, a little ivory set that they had a set of cutlery for kids. So I have a lot of this stuff that I have to figure out what to do with. But why I got it is the story behind the Beaver Falls Cutlery Company and that crazy token that I ran across in a local coin shop. And I discovered history of the Harmonists, understand a little bit more about George Rapp and the Baptists, Anabaptists, and then understood how those waves of history just seem to intertwine and entangle. And when I was researching, I also saw a very strange book in Chinese that was in their library, behind glass, called, and I found out later, called The Dream of the Red Chamber. And the reason why I add this is about 2 years ago, since more Asians are coming to the US, someone visited Beaver Falls, saw that book, and saw that it's exceedingly rare, handwritten, hand illustrated copy of that book, The Dream of the Red Chamber, by one of the most, like the Shakespeare of China, and it is immeasurably valuable, which the library didn't know, nor did I know until they saw it. So, in terms of all of these, you can take virtually any coin, I think, as I look at it. One of the reasons why I got into world coins, and it's in their stories in US coins as well, is there are interesting tidbits about each and every one of them. And these are simply a few that I found, and a few of the coins that I have and that I wanted to share with you today. So if you have any questions, I'll be glad to field them.